This is He Who Moans, Doctor Who reviews. I only complain because I like Doctor Who and I care. And I overanalyze too much because, whatever, it's just my opinion.
Now on to the third run of the 8th Doctor on Bigfinish, which got weird, kind of out of their depth and very controversial. Some appreciated it, some hated it, a few loved it, and all of these are now at recommended retail price, so anyone without the funds may end up being priced out at this point. Before continuing, we had a brief divergence. God, I did just do that, didn't I? Where the 8th Doctor takes Romana to revisit a story from the 70s that he can't remember called Shada. The setup of redoing Shada with the 8th Doctor is a little bit contrived, and it basically means that the Doctor and Romana have both lived this story before, but can't remember it for some reason. So technically the prologue that they stitched onto it makes out that it's a sequel to Shada, as well as being a remake of Shada, which is a difficult concept to wrap your brain around. It's basically Shada, the Inception edition. It's good because Shada was always good, but you do go through it thinking that something's a little bit off and it should be Tom Baker doing this, even though Paul McGann is as great as always. The version of this that you can get on DVD with Tom Baker's linking narration for the unfilmed bits is better, but this one's good for what it is, and, well, very good by other standards. It's Douglas Adams, and we'll have to make do with it until someone perfects cloning technology, as I'm sure that bringing back Douglas Adams is high on the list of priorities of people working in that field, and if it's not, it fucking well should be. Get your priorities sorted, people. So now we enter into Bigfinish's controversial Divergent Universe saga. I'm sort of one of its defenders, in the tiniest way possible, because although it didn't go nearly as crazy with the now the Doctor has been exiled to a universe without time concept that they introduced at the end of Zagreus, I think that the hate that it gets is a tad undeserved. It's got some really solid stories in it. I liked a lot more than I disliked, and, well, I love a few of them. Though the story arc is nowhere near as solid as the Web of Time cracking, and the problems that this arc had really aren't that well hidden. It suffers from similar flaws to the complaints that I level of the Moffat era a fair bit, and I'd be lying if I didn't admit that it wants to be much cleverer than it actually is, again. It suffers from Gary Russell's usual delusions of grandeur that he's famous for in fan circles, as he was heavily in charge of the arc's creative direction. I still enjoyed the Divergent arc on the whole, in spite of its obvious flaws which I'll get to. It's kind of weird and experimental, and relies heavily on strange concepts, which, yes, can be kind of gimmicky. Overall, while a bit of a wasted opportunity in many places in terms of the story arc, I applaud them for trying, and I don't think it's nearly as patchy as people say it is. We start with Scherzo, another from Rob Shearman, so of course it's one of my favourite Bigfinish plays ever. And no, this was not biased based on me already being a fan of his, though yes, I am a fucking fanboy. Here is the Shearman shrine in my bookshelf. All praise to the Great One. Scherzo is the weirdest and most experimental Doctor Who story that you could possibly conceive of, a fact that's left many people lukewarm on it. And I kinda see why, because it goes very far outside the Doctor Who comfort zone. But speaking as an obtuse, pretentious little fuck, you're really, really missing out if you can't get into this one, because I personally think it's fucking gorgeous. Basically, it's a two-hander where the Doctor and Charlie are in the Divergent Universe, and the TARDIS is breaking apart, and they're both having to try and hold on to their sense of selves in a world that doesn't follow the laws of a physical universe, and find themselves trapped by a malevolent presence in the nothingness. I won't spoil any more, as, like with most of Shearman's work, again that would ruin it, and while it does refer to lots of the baffling stuff that happened in Zagreus that you kind of need the context for in case you were thinking about skipping that mad shit, which, even though I love it, I honestly wouldn't blame you, Scherzo is a must-listen as it's one of the most introspective pieces in Doctor Who canon. Fans of Shearman will know that he's big on introspection, and here he approaches the theme of what it means to be a companion of the Doctor under the surface, and fashions the environment around exploring it. While many did complain that the characterisation of the 8th Doctor significantly shifted from hopeless romantic to scowling and melodramatic by this point, most of that was Zagreus' fault, and I personally think that Scherzo does a great job in justifying that shift. It also makes full use of the universe doesn't follow our rules concept. The way in which it gets you to mentally process its setting is just ingenious. Full segments of it literally don't take place in a physical world, meaning it could only ever function as an audio drama. It really just leaves me floored at being able to say anything more insightful about Scherzo. Lots of it just defies description. I do recognise people's complaints about Scherzo's obtuseness, but I personally disagree with all of them and think it's a fucking work of genius. A lot of people out there wish that Shearman could have given us more plays, as it's his last one that he wrote for Bigfinish, aside from a segment of their 100th release a few years later. But given how fucking astonishing the short story collections he's been doing since then are, I'm fully content never hearing a Who play from him ever again, and that's high praise given the tongue baths that you've heard me give them. Seriously, go buy Shearman's books, they're fucking awesome. Following Scherzo, we have Creed of Croman, one of the most highly slated plays in the Bigfinish catalogue. Partly because it followed a play which can reduce grown men to tears, but also because Creed of Croman was heralded as the grand return of Philip Martin, who wrote Vengeance on Varos and Mind Warp back in the 80s. Both of which I will admit that I vastly understated in my 6th Doctor video from a couple of years ago. And unfortunately Croman came out a bit bland and rubbish. Conceptually I think Croman's a sound enough idea, it's just really poorly executed. Basically, the Doctor and Charlie wind up on a desert planet populated by humanoid chameleon monsters, including our new companion Caerdroia, one of their society's royalty, and his world has been taken over by evil insectoid accountants. Okay, say that out loud to yourselves. Evil insectoid accountants. I mean, with all of the body horror stuff that it does, with Caerdroia having to kill his lover, yes, it's all very heavy-handed and melodramatic, possibly more so than the end of Zagreus, and that's really saying something. It doesn't offer us much character insight, but just expects us to be invested anyway, and it's more boring than anything, but the evil insects work for a corporation. And the Doctor comments on how this is supposed to be a universe without rules, and here is an evil insect offering me a desk job. To be honest, that's primarily why I'd say sound idea, poor execution. It could have been really funny if they'd gone down the satirical route. The fact it takes itself so blisteringly seriously was definitely this one's Achilles heel. It was around here that we introduced the intermediary character holding this arc together, a snarky shapeshifter called the Croaker, who's a servant of the shadowy divergence of the universe, who guides the Doctor and co as they search for the TARDIS through what's called the Interzone, which are sort of pocket dimensions between portals connecting different sectors of the planet that they're on together. I'm probably not explaining it totally right, but given how convoluted this arc can be, can you fucking blame me? This idea sort of gets interesting around the middle of the next series of Divergent stories, but it's very underdone. Part of that's because the Divergent saga was originally planned to be 4 series long, which is weird because this arc seems to just sort of barely be interested with this premise. More on that later. Next up we have Natural History of Fear, and immediately the brand new companion Caerdroia, a weird-headed chameleon person, has no chance to make an immediate impression, which kind of established him as having little in the way of depth to offer right from the bat. Which is a bit of a shame, as he had a fair bit of potential they never acted on. I'll get on to more about the problem they had with Caerdroia later on, and as we move into the next run. That being said, since we're in a universe designed to make the writing more creative and experimental, the Natural History of Fear fits really well with this premise, and this one is fucking difficult to talk about in particular because it's one of those plays that relies on being unsuited to a visual medium for one, and is highly suited to knowing fuck all about it going in, which is why the description on the site is so vague. Okay, in a nutshell, it's basically Doctor Who does 1984. While you may start rolling your eyes again, as 1984 is another of those overused literary illusions within the realms of pulp fantasy, and part of my love for this one might be based on 1984 being one of my favourite books. Yeah, I kind of fell for that trick that I'm always pointing out when it comes to over-reliance on literary illusions. But all natural history really borrows from Orwell is the bare bones, and it does enough of its own thing with said bare bones to make itself stand out. If you're into dystopian narratives, you'll find it a fun little story about an administration editing people's memories. As you can probably tell, it's got quite a lot of meta elements in there when it comes to the Doctor's effect on the civilizations that he visits. If you're a nerd for metafiction, you'll find a lot to love about this one. To end the first series of plays in a universe without time, we have the Twilight Kingdom, which is another with a bit of a bad reputation. I wouldn't call it bad as such, just unremarkable really. What it's actually about. The Doctor and co enter a cave which is being used as a hideout by terrorists on a planet somewhere, and people are being killed and absorbed into the cave walls. I wonder why. Yeah, it's a fairly standard mixture of base under siege and body horror, with a fairly decent ending I will admit. It does kind of do a similar thing to the reveal of Chimes of Midnight. Episode 4 is actually pretty decent, But it doesn't justify it being 130 minutes long though. The extreme padding in episodes 1 through 3 really doesn't do this story any favours.
If at least 30% of Zagreus was kind of unnecessary, this one could have easily been 45 minutes long and you really wouldn't lose a whole lot.
Yeah, this one's got the opposite of 45-minute syndrome. I'm thinking about christening it boring and flabby syndrome. The obvious criticism of Twilight Kingdom is a rather unfair one, yes, as it doesn't affect this story's inherent merits at all, which there are a few. It at least works. It does have its fans, and I see why, as episode 4 was pretty interesting, but the following is a major criticism that you can easily level of most of the arc's stories, and you've probably figured it out already. This conceit could easily take place in a normal universe, couldn't it? The Divergent arc started out with a high concept that it ended up doing, well, not a whole lot with. It started out by making out that we were at the end of 2001 A Space Odyssey going through the Stargate, but to go from the weirdness levels of Scherzo, which is the end of Space Odyssey weird, to the Twilight Kingdom, which sounds very, very normal for Doctor Who, well yeah, can you blame people for their reactions to it? I mean, even if you weren't going to follow Rob Shearman's take on this is a universe not following any of our rules and just go the weird concepts route, fine, you know? If you're going to go full Alice in Wonderland, go full Alice in Wonderland. This is the place to go full Alice in Wonderland. But Twilight Kingdom just isn't weird enough. McGann's given big speeches about how alien and weird this setup's supposed to be, but we're back at Moffat speak here. There's a difference between making someone feel something and telling someone to feel something. Maybe I and most are harder on Twilight Kingdom than we should be because we're supposed to be in the middle of a story arc, and as said, I spent most of this one waiting for the series plot to show up again. As said, it's functional, and not as bad as its reputation would indicate, but the Divergent arc was starting to feel less like a slow-paced story unfurling, and more like it was making excuses not to bother delving further into the story arc. And while you could say similar things about Natural History of Fear, the script here just wasn't as strong as that one to get away with the lack of cohesion that the Divergent Universe saga really suffers from. Faith Stealer kicks off the second series, and is the next one that I like in this arc after Scherzo Natural History, and one I'm going to get to, as it's at least got an interesting concept to work with, even if we're still kind of putting the story arc thing that this series of plays is supposed to be about to one side again. But you'll see why that doesn't really bother me with this one in a second. Basically, a zone called the Multi-Haven contains people from every religion in existence coexisting together in complete harmony. I know, weird, right? Yet strange how that's possibly the most unthinkable concept in this franchise. Really, that's a fucking inspired setup. I really like that Graham Duff basically looked at the standard idealist picture of people of all colours and creeds holding hands beneath a rainbow and thought, what if that was the setting for a Doctor Who story? It sees the Doctor and co show up and invent their own religion to integrate into the society, and find that one rogue religion is going around killing others off to convert the zone to one faith. Because of course that's the plot to go with a concept like this one, because what other stakes could you possibly attach to a society like that? Yet it plays out in a fairly standard Doctor Who-ish way, and is a tad predictable in parts. I guess the concept only really allows for one specific type of threat. It's definitely the concept that makes this one what it is. It does feel much more weird and alien than Twilight Kingdom did, but with a more fantastical approach to sci-fi than Scherzo. While it's only sort of grandiose and out there, it ended up being like a Toby Whithouse story. While the execution's not what you call daring, I'd be surprised if you said it wasn't at the very least fun. And hell, I'm not a total miserable shithead. I like fun. Hooray for fun! The Last is up next. Poorly named as it's not even the penultimate. And I quite like it, don't love it, but it's pretty decent. While the script is good, very good in fact, it's got to be the bleakest, most depressing and downtrodden Doctor Who story ever written. So if you want a Doctor Who story to soundtrack curling up in a ball and silently contemplating how miserable existence is, The Last is great for that purpose. If you're feeling in quite a good mood though, here's my advice. Don't. Basically, the Doctor and co wind up on the surface of the Divergent planet, which is stupidly named Bortrazoi, which is a name that I cannot take anywhere near as seriously as the story clearly wants me to.
Bort? Oh, come on, Bort?
Which has been decimated by war and is in the middle of a nuclear winter, and they find a bunker beneath the planet where the government have been hiding out, where their ruler is seemingly convinced that the planet hasn't been totally levelled and is planning a victory speech. It's a decent post-apocalyptic political thriller with a sort of Doctor Strangelove vibe to it. While nowhere near as interested with our story arc as much as it is with being a punishingly satirical cautionary anti-war tale, I'd be hard-pressed to argue with the script. It's really eventful and emotionally involving, and has some great performances from our regulars. And Carolyn Jones in particular really shines as the leader, comedically named Excelsior, and Conrad Westmass as Cariz actually gets the time to start being more interesting here. Though listeners who are all too familiar with Moffat's lack of ability to follow through on empty promises, when we start getting hints about Cariz's religion's attitude towards death and what's going to happen in the future, as that's heavily emphasised starting around here, leading all the way up to his departure in the next run, just a warning, don't get taken in. I am kinda glad the last chooses to focus more on the story at hand than the overall plot, because as said, it's a good one, but if you, like me, were still holding on to the hope that this mammoth game of run-around zones on a planet somewhere was going to lead to more than what we sort of got introduced to around here, which gets spread over the last 3 Divergent stories, the blunt answer is no. Spoiler warning. Basically, around here we sort of get an explanation of why there are interdimensional portals separating the planet into zones that we've seen so far, the Multi-Haven, Cariz's planet, etc. But it's incredibly underdone. As I mentioned earlier, this arc was planned to be a total of 16 releases long, so it kind of feels to me like the slight dribs and drabs that got shoehorned into the last Caerdroia and the next life regarding the people of the Divergent Universe were planned to have more detail before the arc was dropped earlier than intended. Basically, the Divergents are supposed to have created this planet to conduct evolutionary experiments on. Hence the separate zones, each with their own weird theme. We don't get much more than that though, it just sort of shoves that fact out there. We don't really go much further with it, which is a shame as it's a great idea that we could have done a lot more with, but yeah, the Doctor and Co have been in the Divergent's planet-sized laboratory the whole time. It's pretty much all it is. Caerdroia is up next, and it's easily the best one since Natural History of Fear. It's really hard not to like this one. The Doctor and Co finally challenge the Croaker to show them where the Divergent people are, so that he can find his TARDIS, and so the Croaker takes them to Caerdroia, a bizarre area where there's a huge labyrinth and a surreal landscape of weird creatures, giant clocks, and the Doctor gets split into 3 people, each one embodying a different aspect of his personality. Oh my gosh guys, we've hit whimsy factor 5000! Apparently Gary Russell initially asked Lloyd Rose to write a hard fantasy story, which is a weird thing to ask Lloyd Rose to do if you've ever read any of her Doctor Who books, which you totally should by the way. But what she actually ended up coming out with was incredibly fun, and while it's not really plot heavy, it's a very video gamey setup of sets of characters must get from point A to point B, but I felt it was highly appropriate to do a more light-hearted piece with more of a focus on character interactions given the way this arc had been going. Since character is Lloyd Rose's strong point, it was important for the dynamic between 8, Charlie and Cariz to do something as fun as this one, and she probably should have been brought in much earlier on to iron out some of the problems that they've been having up until this point. In terms of the story arc, it's suited to being the penultimate Divergent Universe story, but it really shouldn't have taken this long for the fallout from the end of Zagreus between Charlie and the Doctor to start fading, and for Cariz to start growing a bit. But still, now it's come along, not going to be ungrateful for how much fun Caerdroia is. As I said earlier, if you're going to go full Alice in Wonderland, the Divergent Universe is the place to go full Alice in Wonderland, and Lloyd Rose did so in a different way to how most bits of media go full Alice in Wonderland. Like, you know how pretty much every bit of media that invokes Alice in Wonderland in some way almost always goes the dark and gritty route, and that the original Alice in Wonderland is supposed to be this light-hearted, weird fairy tale with a bit of a loose relationship with reality? Well, yeah, Caerdroia is one of few entries in pulp fantasy that I've seen that follows more in that route. But it does have its own ideas, and were it done by anyone else, I might be calling it insubstantial, as it doesn't do much with the story arc like most in the Divergent saga don't, but it's just so bloody charming that I don't know how anyone can be bitter towards Caerdroia over anything. Also, go read Camera Obscura. The next life brings the Divergent Universe saga to a close in a traditionally by this point very long-winded fashion. While it being 6 parts long as opposed to 4 and closer to Zagreus in length feels in principle like the right idea to bookend this arc with, in spite of the screamingly obvious criticism of Zagreus being it is far too long, the next life was an hour shorter, and even though it was longer than usual and designed to feel more epic, it just ended up feeling like there wasn't enough material to flesh out over 3 hours. It could have easily been 4 parts long and you wouldn't really lose anything. This was also the one that ended up being the prototype for what we came to call Stephen Moffat syndrome. There were a bunch of loose story threads hanging about everywhere that Gary Russell didn't really know what to do with, and it came out sounding kind of flabby, long-winded, and incredibly padded. That being said though, the first 2 parts I really like. I mean really, really like. It starts out very promisingly. It appeared as though we were in a more coherent version of the Alan Barnes and Gary Russell mental weird dreamscape land from Zagreus, where Charlie and Cariz are confronted by manifestations of their pasts, asking what if the mental thing that caused me to meet the Doctor never happened in the first place. And Cariz is finally given the chance to start growing a bit of an interesting backstory, but then it just sort of flat out stops doing that bit, and suddenly all of our characters are on a tropical island somewhere for the next 4 episodes, with a random American lady played by Daphne Ashbrook, who you'll recognise was Grace in the TV movie. A fact which actually has no relevance to anything. Which is weird given Gary Russell's love of continuity wanking, where people from Cariz's planet are acting as missionaries from their church, spreading their religion among the natives. And pretty much nothing of consequence happens from there. Actually, no, that's unfair of me. A bit of consequence stuff showed up towards the end of episode 4, start of episode 5, but I probably would have preferred we mixed the 2 angles of the plot throughout. Mixing Charlie and Cariz returning to their roots via Dreamscape, with the Doctor looking for the TARDIS and an escape to the Divergent Universe on the island, I just felt that an intercut story would have fit a lot better than the sort of plotty one thing leads to another runaround that we got here. This story just invited me in, going, "Look, Stuart, we're going to go speculative and introspective. You like that?" And then it pulled the rug out from under my feet and goes, "Ha! Fooled you! Here's 4 episodes of padding." The cast are great as always though, and are what holds the highly muddled script together, especially Don Warrington as Rassilon. But it just feels to me like the reaction that many people had to Zagreus coerced Gary into deciding to make the next life more conventional. It kind of sums up the problem I ended up having with the Divergent arc. It started out with an incredibly ambitious premise, promising much more creativity than it actually delivered on. While I enjoyed it on the whole, I just wished that they'd taken a chance again, like with Zagreus, and been a bit weirder more often.